The flight was supposed to be routine until a flight attendant looked at a quiet black man in first class and told him, "You're in the wrong seat." She didn't know who he was, but 4 minutes later, she was the one being escorted off the plane, and the whole cabin went silent. Before we start the story, comment below where, in the world you're watching from today. And if you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you always stay updated. The boarding area buzzed with quiet conversation as travelers in business attire adjusted their bags and glanced at departure screens. In the middle of the crowd stood an older black man with close-cropped, salt-and-pepper hair, dressed in a charcoal gray suit. His name was Eldon Graves, though no one around him seemed to recognize it. He carried no flashy luggage, just a slim black briefcase in one hand and a quiet look of focus on his face. He didn't fidget, didn't rush. He waited his turn like everyone else, his calm posture drawing quiet space around him. When the first-class boarding call was made, Eldon stepped forward, scanned his ticket, and moved down the jet bridge without a word. He entered the aircraft and walked directly to seat 1A. The cabin was softly lit, the scent of leather and faint cologne hanging in the air. Only a few other passengers had boarded, 2 middle-aged men and a young woman tapping on her laptop. Eldon placed his briefcase gently in the overhead bin, adjusted the cuff of his white shirt, and lowered himself into the seat without hesitation. He unfolded a newspaper from his inside jacket pocket, settled back, and began to read. Across the cabin, a flight attendant named Melanie Dorsey walked past the rows with practiced steps. Her uniform was pressed, her hair pulled tightly back, her expression clipped and unreadable. But when she reached 1A, her stride slowed. Her eyes moved from Eldon's face to his suit, then to his hands resting on the newspaper. Something flickered in her expression. She stopped beside his seat and spoke without smiling. "Excuse me, sir," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Eldon looked up slowly, folding his newspaper in half. He held out the printed boarding pass without a word. She took it without thanking him and scanned it with a handheld device. The screen gave a soft confirmation beep, but Melanie didn't move. Her brow furrowed slightly as she double-checked the seat number. "This is seat 1A, she said. "That's what my ticket says," Eldon replied calmly. There was no sarcasm in his tone, no aggression, just fact. But Melanie stood there for a beat too long, the pause more telling than anything she said. She handed the pass back with stiff fingers. "Please remain seated," she said. "I just need to confirm something with the gate." She turned without waiting for a response and walked quickly toward the galley. In the second row, a man in a navy blue sport coat glanced up. His name was Trent Barlow, a finance consultant who'd been watching the exchange over the rim of his coffee cup. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered on Melanie's stiff back as she disappeared behind the curtain. In the galley, Melanie grabbed the cabin phone with quick fingers. Her voice was low but tight. "This is Dorsey in the cabin. Can you double-check a passenger for me? Seat 1A. Name is Eldon Graves, older gentleman. I just want to make sure the ticket's legitimate." The reply came after a pause. "It's confirmed, first class, booked almost 6 weeks ago. No issues." Melanie didn't respond. She hung up the phone slowly, her mouth a thin, hard line. Instead of returning to Eldon with an apology or an update, she took a deep breath, adjusted her name badge, and turned back toward the cabin. Her expression had shifted, calmer on the outside, colder underneath. And while the cabin remained quiet, something small had already cracked open. Eldon returned to reading his paper, but for the first time that morning, his jaw had tightened. Just slightly, Melanie returned to the first-class cabin with her steps tighter. Her mouth set in a line that looked polite, but didn't feel that way. She stopped next to Eldon's seat again, this time with a clipboard in hand. She didn't offer an apology. Instead, she said, "Mr. Graves, I'm going to ask you to step into the galley with me for a moment. There appears to be an issue with the reservation system." Eldon folded his newspaper calmly and looked at her with quiet focus. "What kind of issue?" he asked. His tone wasn't confrontational, just still, like someone used to being challenged without cause. "I just need to verify something directly with the front." Melanie replied, not quite meeting his eyes. "If you'll follow me, please." From across the aisle, Trent Barlow set his coffee down now, fully alert. Behind him, a young couple, Olivia and Sean Kramer, traveling to San Francisco for their honeymoon, paused their conversation, picking up on the shift in energy. Eldon stood without fuss, tucked the paper into the seat pocket, and adjusted his jacket. "Of course," he said quietly. He followed Melanie down the aisle toward the galley. Eyes followed them. No one said anything, but the silence started to bend around the edges. Olivia leaned closer to Sean and whispered, "Did something happen?" Sean shrugged, but both of them turned to watch the front of the cabin. Inside the galley, Melanie placed her clipboard on the counter and turned to face him. "There's just a small mix-up," she said too quickly. "Your name didn't match the manifest in the system. It may have been entered wrong by the gate agent." Eldon raised one eyebrow. "Is that so?" he said. His voice remained calm, but the look in his eyes sharpened just enough to make Melanie shift her weight from one foot to the other. "I'm sure it's nothing," she added a bit too late. "We just need to be certain everything is correct before departure." Eldon said nothing for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and made a call. "Yes," he said quietly into the receiver. "It's happening again. Please go ahead." He ended the call and placed the phone calmly back into his pocket. His expression didn't change. He didn't explain what the call was about. He didn't have to. Melanie blinked, caught off guard. "Sir, may I ask who you just called?" "You may," Eldon replied, "but I won't be answering that." He glanced toward the curtain separating them from the cabin. "Now if we're finished here, I'd like to return to my seat." Melanie didn't respond. She watched him walk back into the aisle, his back straight, his steps steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't push back, but something about the way he moved made her throat tighten. Back in first class, Trent glanced up as Eldon passed. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked. Eldon gave a small nod. "It will be," he said, and then he sat back down in seat one. A folded his hands in his lap and waited. The mood in the first-class cabin had shifted. It was subtle but undeniable. A few passengers cast glances toward the front, pretending to read or scroll their phones while listening closely. A sense of discomfort crept in, not because Eldon Graves had done anything wrong, but because something wasn't sitting right with how he was being treated. Eldon resumed his seat without a word, but his calm expression no longer hid the quiet storm building behind his eyes. His jaw tensed ever so slightly as he adjusted his seatbelt and stared ahead. Across the aisle, Trent Barlow observed him with a thoughtful frown. A few seats behind them, Olivia Kramer nudged her husband gently. "Why is she bothering him?" she whispered. Sean shrugged again but didn't look away. "No idea, has done absolutely nothing." Eldon's thoughts moved faster than he showed. This wasn't the first time someone looked at him and saw what they wanted to see, someone who didn't fit their expectations. A man who looked out of place. He had dealt with it for decades. Bank tellers who asked twice to confirm his name. Hotel staff who assumed he was with another guest. Luxury salesmen who greeted others first. But rarely had it played out this openly, and certainly not in an airline where he held part ownership. Behind the curtain, Melanie stood stiff in the galley, staring blankly at the wall. Her stomach fluttered with something close to unease, but her pride held firm. She didn't like being questioned. She didn't like being doubted, and she certainly didn't like the way Eldon had made that phone call. Like he knew something she didn't. She reached for the cabin phone and called for support, this time requesting assistance from the ground supervisor before the plane pushed back. As she waited, another flight attendant stepped into the galley. Carlos Meyer, a young man with steady hands and a calm way of handling problems. He glanced at her clipboard, then back at Melanie. "Everything all right?" Carlos asked. Melanie hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There's something off with that guy in one. The name checks out, but I don't know. I just have a feeling." Carlos blinked. "You mean the older gentleman? He showed his ticket, right?" She nodded yes. "It's just something's not adding up," Carlos said gently. "We can make assumptions based on vibes. If his boarding pass matches and it's confirmed, that's the end of it." Melanie stiffened. "I'm not making assumptions." "I'm following procedure." Carlos paused, then nodded once. "All right, but be careful. Everyone's watching now." Back in the cabin, Eldon sat still, his gaze fixed ahead, but inwardly his mind was alert. He had already contacted his executive assistant, who had in turn notified the airline's operations team. He didn't want a scene. He never did. But this wasn't something he was going to let slide. Meanwhile, the first-class cabin grew quieter. Passengers had put down their reading. The air felt heavier now. Trent leaned over slightly and said in a low voice, "You handled that with a lot of patience." "Mr. Graves," Eldon said not unkindly. Trent," he replied, "and I just want to say, if that had been me, I wouldn't have kept my cool like that." Eldon gave him a nod, eyes tired but steady. "You learn when to speak," he said, "and when silence does the speaking for you." Just then the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, begin pushback shortly. Please remain seated as we finalize a minor issue with seating." The tone was calm, but it sent another ripple through the cabin. Olivia turned to Sean again. "This is so strange," she whispered. "Why is he being treated like a threat when he's done nothing but sit quietly?" Sean didn't answer. He looked toward Eldon again, then toward the front where Melanie still hadn't returned. Something wasn't right, and they all knew it. In that moment, Melanie received a second call, but this time it wasn't from the ground staff. It was from the airline's executive operations office. And what she heard on the line made her grip tighten on the edge of the galley counter. Her face lost color. Her voice cracked slightly as she answered, "This is Melanie." The reply was firm. "We've been contacted by a primary stakeholder currently seated in first class on your flight. We need full clarification of the situation immediately. Do not proceed with any further passenger movement until we instruct otherwise." Melanie barely whispered her response. Understood, but her hands were already shaking, and she was starting to realize this wasn't just any passenger, and she had just made a very big mistake. Melanie stood frozen in the galley, her hands still on the phone. The line had gone dead, but the weight of the voice on the other end lingered. It hadn't just been a warning. It had been a shift, a quiet, undeniable shift in power. She wasn't in control anymore, and something inside her knew it. She turned slowly and caught Carlos watching her from the service counter. He didn't say anything, but his eyes said enough. She straightened her blazer, smoothed her hands down the front of her skirt, and stepped toward the curtain. As she moved to return to the cabin, her steps were slower, less certain than before. The moment she appeared, eyes lifted across the cabin. First class had gone still. Conversations had stopped. Olivia set down her water. Trent folded his arms and leaned slightly forward. Even the couple in the last row, Beth and Martin Lowell, who had been silently watching from the beginning, were now fully alert. Melanie walked to Eldon's seat with a look that tried to mimic confidence, but the tightness in her jaw betrayed her. "Mr. Graves," she said, voice low, but clipped, "I've been instructed to ask you and your belongings to move to the main cabin while we sort out the confusion with your reservation." A beat of silence passed. Eldon didn't look surprised. In fact, his face remained perfectly still, almost too still. "On what grounds?" he asked, his voice level measured. "Because my ticket is valid, the manifest matches, and your own device confirms seat 1. So unless there's a new policy, I'd like to know what makes you think I don't belong here." Melanie faltered for half a second. "It's just protocol," she said quickly. The word's automatic now. When there's a discrepancy, There is no discrepancy," Eldon said, still quiet. "Only your discomfort." Her face flushed. She glanced around the cabin, suddenly aware of the eyes now firmly locked on her. The murmurs started quiet but growing. Beth leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Has handled this with more grace than I ever could." Martin nodded slowly, watching intently. From a few seats back, Trent raised his voice slightly, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Is this normal?" he asked. "Because it sure doesn't look like it." Melanie flinched. She looked back down at Eldon. "Sir, I'm just asking you to cooperate." Eldon's gaze didn't soften, and I'm asking for a valid reason. Not protocol, not a feeling, not a guess. The tension spread like ripples in still water. Olivia stood halfway up from her seat. "This is wrong," she said aloud. "He's been respectful the whole time. Why is he the one being removed?" Now Carlos stepped out from the galley, hesitating for just a moment before walking over. He stood beside Melanie and looked down at Eldon. Mr. Graves, he said much softer, I'm sorry for all this. Would you mind stepping into the galley one more time? I think we need to talk. Eldon paused, then nodded once. He stood up slowly, folding his newspaper again, with steady hands. As he stepped into the aisle, he looked directly at Melanie and said, "Let's make one thing clear. I'm not angry, but I don't forget moments like these." That sentence hung in the air as he disappeared behind the curtain, with Carlos inside the galley the moment the curtain closed. Carlos spoke fast and quiet. "Sir, forgive me for the confusion. I just want to let you know. I was told you contacted executive operations. I don't know exactly who you are, but I can tell from the calls we're getting that this isn't going to be handled lightly." Eldon looked at him for a moment, then replied, "One of the people who made this airline possible." Carlos blinked. "Sir, I didn't know. I know you did." Eldon replied, "But that woman, she didn't care to find out." Back in the cabin, Melanie stood in place, frozen in front of the rows of silent passengers. Her ears burned as she listened to the whispers growing again. For the first time, the authority in her voice wasn't returning, and when the galley phone buzzed again, its sharp ring slicing through the heavy quiet, she jumped. She stepped quickly behind the curtain, picked it up and said, "This is Melanie." A stern male voice answered, "This is the captain. I've just spoken directly with corporate. They've confirmed Mr. Graves' identity. Do not move him again. Has to remain in first class, undisturbed." Melanie's hand tightened around the receiver. "Captain," she said, her voice cracking. You thought wrong," the captain cut in. "You need to step back and let the crew handle the rest. Stay in the galley until further notice." She hung up slowly, her face pale. Carlos stood near the service cart, watching her silently. He didn't offer comfort. He simply said, "They're calling in a report." Melanie's stomach dropped. "A report?" Carlos nodded once. "They're not just protecting him. They're reviewing you." Melanie sat down on the jump seat and buried her face in her hands. The curtain rustled quietly behind her. On the other side, Eldon Graves sat once again in seat 1, a legs crossed, newspaper back in hand. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply waited. But this time, the entire cabin waited with him. The tension in the cabin refused to settle. Even with Eldon Graves returned to his seat and the curtain closed behind the galley, silence clung to the air like fog. The passengers in first class weren't talking much now. They were watching Melanie disappear into the back of the plane, watching Eldon quietly resume his seat, watching for what would happen next. Eldon adjusted the crease in his pant leg and unfolded the newspaper again, though he barely glanced at it this time. His mind was on headlines. His thoughts moved inward, remembering moments not too different from this one. Moments when he was told to wait over there, step aside, or hold on while we verify. He had long ago learned not to meet aggression with more of it. Power, had found, was quietest when it was most effective. Across the aisle, Trent Barlow leaned closer again, his voice low but firm. "I've seen a lot of things in corporate," he said. "But this was plain wrong." Eldon gave a slight nod, but said nothing. The words weren't necessary. In the back, Melanie sat motionless on the jump seat, staring down at her hands. She kept trying to replay it differently in her head, trying to find a version of events where she had followed the rules, done the right thing, not let something inside her make a snap decision she couldn't undo. But the truth pressed against her like a weight she couldn't shake. She had made a choice. She had seen Eldon's face, his skin, his age, and something in her had leapt ahead of logic. She hadn't even tried to consider that he might belong there, that he might own the seat, the plane, or even more. Carlos moved quietly around her, organizing trays and checking supplies, but the silence between them grew heavier with each passing minute. Eventually he spoke, his tone calm but sharp. "Mel," he said without looking at her, "what were you expecting when you called him out like that?" She looked up, eyes wide. It didn't look like Carlos raised a hand to stop her. "Don't finish that. I was just trying to." "You weren't trying. You were assuming, and now you've dragged the rest of us into it." His voice never rose, but the disappointment in it hit harder than any shouting could have. Back in the cockpit, the captain sat with his headset slightly off one ear. He had just ended another call with airline headquarters. The updates were no longer just warnings. They were action plans. Executives were monitoring the flight in real time. Legal was reviewing the timeline of events. Public relations had already been alerted, and a message had come through that made him pause. Prepare a statement for internal records. Do not allow the involved crew member to disembark without an interview. He sighed heavily and looked out the windshield where the tarmac shimmered in the morning light. Flights were supposed to run like machines in time by protocol. No surprises, but this was a delay caused by weather or mechanical failure. This was human, and it couldn't be smoothed over with an apology or a voucher. The cabin phone rang again. He answered, and the voice on the other end was sharp. Captain Rhodes, this is Executive Liaison Sanders. I'm calling directly from the board's office. Mr. Graves is a principal shareholder in the company. We're escalating this immediately. You're to ensure he's not disturbed again, and you're to inform your crew that full cooperation is expected for a formal review. Understood? The captain replied, his tone clipped. When the call ended, he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he pressed the intercom and spoke in his calm, professional voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. The situation on board has been reviewed and we're ready to proceed. We ask that everyone remain seated as we finalize our pre-flight checklist. Thank you. The announcement was short, but it confirmed to every listening ear in first class that something had just shifted in a big way. In seat 1A, Eldon remained motionless, only now glancing toward the window as the tug vehicle connected with the aircraft. He was calm, but beneath that a storm had settled into his spine. He had no intention of letting this disappear once the plane landed. No one would be fired quietly and swept away without consequence. Not this time. Olivia leaned across the aisle, her tone quiet but full of emotion. You shouldn't have had to go through that, she said. Eldon met her eyes gently. You're right, but I'm not surprised that I did. Sean frowned. Do you think they'll take action? They already are, Eldon said softly. But that's not enough. Action isn't justice. Change is further down the plane. The economy cabin remained unaware of most of what had taken place, except for the few passengers near the front who had heard enough to guess something serious had happened. But in first class, the tension still sat heavy in the air. Passengers exchanged glances, some sympathetic, some uncomfortable, some quietly angry. As the aircraft began to taxi toward the runway, Melanie stood up from her seat in the galley. Carlos blocked her path. They told me to stay here, she said, her voice hoarse. I know, Carlos replied, and you should. She hesitated, then sat back down. And as the plane accelerated, lifting off the ground with a steady roar, Eldon Graves closed his eyes, not because he was tired, but because the wheels were turning. The flight had just begun, but the reckoning had already taken off. 37 minutes into the flight, the cabin had regained some of its rhythm, at least on the surface. Drinks had been served, headphones passed around, the engines hummed steadily, but inside the first-class section, the unease hadn't lifted. If anything, it had settled deeper. Eldon Graves sat in seat 1, the untouched glass of sparkling water on his tray, casting faint ripples every time the plane shook gently with turbulence. He hadn't said much since takeoff. He didn't need to. Every person in first class knew what had just unfolded, and silence had become their only polite response. Still, the quiet held weight like a held breath that wouldn't release. Across from him, Trent Barlow had stopped pretending to work. His laptop sat open but idle. Every now and then, he glanced at Eldon, then toward the galley. His curiosity wasn't just casual anymore. It was personal, Mr. Graves, Trent said, keeping his voice low. I'm assuming that phone call you made earlier wasn't to a friend. Eldon turned his head slightly. It was to my executive assistant, and she made a call. Trent guessed up the ladder. Eldon nodded once to the boardroom. Trent let out a quiet whistle. That explains the looks of panic on half the staff. It's not about panic. Eldon said, it's about accountability. The truth was, Eldon had worked too hard for too many decades to remain silent when someone mistook prejudice for procedure. He didn't rise through acquisitions, mergers, and corporate boardrooms by being passive. He learned to pick his battle, and when to hold the silence long enough to let someone else hang themselves with it. Behind the curtain in the galley, Melanie sat slumped forward, her elbows on her knees, hands clasped tightly. The confidence she carried at the start of the flight had all but drained away. Her ears still rang with the voice of the captain. Her skin still burned with the weight of all those stare. She had tried to justify her actions to herself. Maybe the ticket looked wrong. Maybe there'd been a name mismatch. Maybe he had been rude, except he hadn't. He had been polite professional. Even kind, which made her judgment harder to explain. Carlos returned from the main cabin, pausing to restock cups. His eyes flicked toward Melanie, then quickly away. "You can keep ignoring me." "Carlos," she muttered, "but I didn't do anything wrong." Carlos didn't respond right away. He stacked the cups slowly. "You didn't do anything," he said finally, "because you assumed everything." Melanie straightened. He didn't act like... Like what? Carlos turned to face her now, like a man who flies. Private more than commercial. Like someone who pays cash for first class and doesn't need to prove himself to you? She flinched. "I just thought exactly," he said, cutting her off. "You thought you didn't check, you didn't ask. You just moved him because it didn't fit your idea of who belongs where." Her throat tightened. "You think I'm the only one who's ever made that mistake?" "No," Carlos replied. "But you're the one who did it today, and now the rest of us are left holding it." The galley phone rang again. Melanie didn't move. Carlos picked it up. "This is Meyer," he said. The captain's voice came through low and measured. "We've received further instruction. Mr. Graves is to be left completely undisturbed for the remainder of the flight. Also inform Ms. Dorsey she'll be required to stay on board upon landing security, and corporate will be meeting the aircraft at the gate." Carlos turned his head slowly toward Melanie. "Understood," he said. He hung up the phone. Melanie swallowed hard. "They're meeting the plane." Carlos nodded. "Not just security executives, too." Her face turned pale. "They're going to fire me mid-air. I don't know," he said quietly, "but they're not going to forget this back in the cabin." Beth Lowell leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Did you see the way she looked when she got that last call?" "She's sweating." Martin frowned. "Well, what did she expect? The man's done nothing wrong. He didn't even raise his voice," Olivia had overheard. "That's what makes it worse," she said softly. "She came at him with all that authority, and he didn't yell, didn't argue, just made one call. That scares people more than shouting." Eldon remained still, one leg crossed over the other, hands folded on his lap. He wasn't relaxed, but he wasn't angry either. He was focused, steady, quiet. He reached for his phone again and tapped out a message. Short, precise, strategic, confirm media. Monitoring draft holding statement. Prepare legal language for board update. I want full documentation of this incident before we land. He hit send and set the phone face down on his tray. Then he looked out the window, thousands of feet above ground, knowing the fallout hadn't even started yet, and this time he intended to make it count. As the plane cruised high above the clouds, the soft hum of the engines seemed to blend into the heaviness that still clung to the first-class cabin. While the rest of the passengers settled into their seats with movies or meals, a current of unease pulsed quietly among those in the front rows. No one said it aloud, but everyone was aware. They were sitting in the middle of something larger than just a seating dispute. Eldon Graves remained in seat 1, a hands calm on his lap, posture composed. He hadn't touched the meal that had been served to him. A perfectly arranged plate of seared chicken and roasted vegetables sat untouched, as if the presentation had nothing to do with what really needed correcting. His attention was on the food. It was on the consequences, those that had already started and those still waiting at the gate. He turned his phone face up again. A new message blinked on the screen. Media alert drafted. Legal is reviewing incident log, board members requesting early meeting post-landing. Eldon nodded to himself, subtle and slow. It was no longer a personal insult. It had become a company matter. He wasn't just a passenger now. He was an accountability trigger. The kind of force that moved policy and made CEOs hold emergency meetings on Sunday mornings behind the galley curtain. Melanie stood with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her eyes were red, not from tears, but from the exhaustion of panic, the mental replay of every decision, every word, every small look that now echoed with judgment. Her hands wouldn't stop fidgeting, brushing against the fabric of her uniform as if trying to smooth away her mistake. Carlos returned from the forward cabin, avoiding eye contact. He leaned into the small storage space and began checking inventory again, anything to stay busy. "You know," Melanie muttered, "it's not like I screamed at him." Carlos didn't look up. "No," he said, "you didn't scream. You judged, you removed him without cause. You used your position to humiliate someone who didn't challenge you." "I followed instinct," she snapped, her voice low. "No," Carlos replied, finally turning to her. "You followed assumption." She fell silent, biting her lip hard. Carlos let the silence settle for a moment, then said, "Do you know who he is?" She shook her head. "Not exactly, just someone important. He co-founded the airline," Carlos said. "Owns a major stake. He doesn't brag, doesn't carry a name tag or a gold watch to prove it. He built this company, quietly from the ground up." Melanie blinked. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Her knees weakened slightly. She backed up until her back hit the galley wall. "Oh, God," she whispered. Carlos looked at her for a long second, then turned away. "You didn't just insult a passenger, you insulted your own employer." Meanwhile, in seat 2, Olivia quietly scrolled through her phone. She had opened a notes app and had begun typing out her version of what had happened, what she saw, what she heard, not for gossip, not for outrage, for evidence. She wasn't the type to post on the social media, but something about the look on Eldon's face when he was asked to move had stuck with her. The quiet, careful way he swallowed it, like he'd done it before. Like he knew how much it would cost to react in the wrong tone. Trent Barlow leaned over and asked her, "Do you think he's going to sue them?" Olivia shrugged. "Maybe, but I don't think that's what he's after." Trent raised a brow. "No, I think he wants to change something bigger than just his seat," she replied, back at the rear of first class. Carlos opened the galley phone again and made a discreet call to the cockpit. "Captain Rhodes," he said, "update from the ground. Mr. Gravis' legal team has submitted a formal notice of internal review. We've also been told media outlets have been tipped off to an incident on board involving possible racial discrimination." There was a pause. Then the captain replied, "Understood. Well, keep it quiet on board, but well prepare for media presence at the gate." The call ended. Carlos sighed quietly and hung up the receiver. Melanie had heard everything. Her face had drained completely now. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed, and she lowered herself onto the jump seat. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked. Carlos didn't respond. She stared at her hands. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "That's the problem," Carlos said softly. "You never thought it would." In seat 1. Eldon picked up his pen and began writing on the back of a folded notepad. His handwriting was neat, every line with intent. "When we teach authority without accountability, we raise gatekeepers who protect the gate, but never ask who built it. Today was never about a seat. It was about the assumption that I didn't deserve it." He closed the notepad. He didn't know yet whether he would publish those words, but he knew one thing for certain: someone would read them. Someone needed to, not to shame, not to destroy, but to confront the system that still made moments like this possible. He pressed the call button for the flight attendant. Carlos appeared quickly. "Yes, Mr. Graves." Eldon looked up and nodded toward his tray. "You can clear this. I'm not hungry." Carlos took the tray, quietly pausing just before he turned away. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm sorry, sir." Eldon held his gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I appreciate that, but save it for after the landing. That's when the real apology begins." And as Carlos walked away, Eldon returned to his silence. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the right ears hadn't arrived yet. They would soon, and when they did, they'd be met with more than silence. They'd be met with truth. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight entered the final hour before landing. Outside, the clouds broke in long ribbons of white and gold, the sun setting gently into the curve of the sky. Inside, however, the mood was thick, anchored in tension and uncertainty. While some passengers had returned to their books or screens, none had truly forgotten what happened earlier. The air still carried the residue of the earlier confrontation, an awkward silence that no beverage cart or dinner service could clean. Eldon Graves sat with his eyes closed, not asleep but focused. He didn't need noise to know what was happening around him. He could feel it in the way people looked at him now, more respectfully, more cautiously. He could feel it in the tone of the captain's announcements, now laced with forced calm. And he could feel it in the way Carlos approached him now, not with stiff service protocol, but with the quiet posture of someone who understood that lines had been crossed. In the galley, Melanie sat alone. The other attendants rotated their duties without asking her to help. No one said it aloud, but she'd been removed in everything but title. Her badge still clung to her uniform, but the authority behind it had vanished the moment the truth about Eldon's status reached the crew. She gripped the edge of the metal, counter with both hands, trying to steady the growing panic in her chest. The word shareholder echoed over and over in her mind. She had asked a company stakeholder to leave first class, a man who could walk into a board meeting and shift policy with a single comment. Her mind spun with what might happen when the flight touched down as security HR termination. She hadn't even tried to speak with him again. She didn't know what to say. I was just doing my job. Felt like a paper shield. I didn't know who you were. Wasn't a defense. The truth was uglier, and she knew it. She had judged him. Not for anything he said or did, but simply for who he was and how he looked, and he knew it too. Back in the cabin, Carlos approached Eldon again, this time with a fresh glass of water and a soft tone. "Just a few updates, sir," he said quietly. "The captain asked me to inform you that representatives from the executive team will be meeting the plane at the gate. They've been briefed and are awaiting your statement." Eldon nodded slowly. "I assume there will be others?" Carlos hesitated. Media was not officially confirmed, but there's talk of press presence. A few passengers may have shared some details. Eldon's eyes opened calm and sharp. "I expected that. Let them report. Let it unfold publicly." Carlos swallowed. "Would you like us to escort you off the plane privately?" "No," Eldon said simply. "I boarded through the front." "He'll leave through it." Carlos gave a quiet nod and stepped away. A few rows back, Olivia had received a text from a journalist friend. Her earlier notes had already reached someone in media. Not by her doing, she hadn't shared them, but news was moving faster than she'd thought possible. The message read, "Passenger claims airline co-founder removed from first class, mid-flight. Can you confirm?" She stared at her phone. A second message followed. Was it racial profiling? She didn't answer. Not yet. She looked up at Eldon, seated calmly in one, then back at her screen. Her heart twisted. She didn't want to sensationalize what had happened, but she also didn't want to let it slide into silence. Sean looked over her shoulder. "Are they asking?" She nodded. "I didn't even post anything. I think someone else did." He paused, then said, "You should tell them the truth. What we saw back in the galley." Melanie stood up abruptly, unable to sit still. She paced a few steps, her nerves raw. "I need to speak with him," she muttered. Carlos looked up from arranging utensils. "Now I owe him that." Carlos didn't move. "It's your choice, but I don't think you'll get the answer you want." Melanie pushed the curtain aside and walked slowly down the aisle. The eyes that had once been on Eldon now turned to her. Some were confused, others judgmental. No one smiled. She stopped at one. Hands clasped tightly. Eldon didn't look up at first, then he did slowly, as if the time he took to meet her eyes said more than anything else. "Mr. Graves," she said, her voice small. I want to apologize for earlier. I was wrong to question you. Wrong to make assumptions. I know an apology can't undo it, but I needed to say it." Eldon studied her, his expression unreadable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't humiliate her, but the weight of his stare was enough to make her shift on her feet. "Ms. Dorsey," he said finally, "do you know how many times I've been offered apologies like this?" She swallowed hard. "No, neither do I," he replied, "because I stopped counting years ago." She looked down. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "No one ever does," he said, his tone cool but controlled. "But it still does, over and over. What matters isn't your apology. It's whether the next person in my seat gets treated any differently." She nodded slowly, her throat thick. "Go back to the galley," he said. "You've said what you needed to say. Now let's see what your company says." She turned and walked back slowly, her shoulders heavy, as she disappeared behind the curtain again. Olivia whispered to Sean, He handled that with more grace than I could have mustered. Sean nodded. He's not just trying to fix what happened to him. He's trying to change the system that allows it to happen at all. Eldon leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes once more and waited, not for the landing, but for the reckoning waiting on the other side of it. The fasten seatbelt sign lit up as the plane began its slow descent into San Francisco. A quiet ding echoed through the cabin, followed by the captain's steady voice over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach. Please return your seatbacks and tray tables to their upright positions and ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. But there was no shift in energy, no stretching, no casual chatter. Not in first class. Every passenger remained quietly upright, eyes occasionally flicking toward the front row. The usual pre-landing rituals, bathroom lines overhead, bin checks were replaced with glances between seats. Silent anticipation and the unspoken awareness that this landing wasn't going to be ordinary. Eldon Graves sat with his hands folded over his lap, posture unchanged. The quiet confidence he wore like a second skin never broke. The sun had lowered further in the sky, now casting golden slants of light through the window beside him. He didn't reach for his phone again. He didn't need to. He had already done what needed to be done. The airline had responded. Now it was their turn to face him. Behind the galley curtain, Melanie stood rigid against the bulkhead, her eyes darting between the cabin clock and the curtain. Each minute felt longer than the last. She kept trying to imagine what would happen once the wheels touched the ground. Would it be a conversation, a warning, a pink slip handed over in front of the crew? Carlos stood beside her, arms crossed, face calm but unreadable. He'd been watching her unravel all flight long. She had stopped talking 2 hours ago, and now she simply stood, her face pale, her mouth slightly open like she was rehearsing an apology. She would never get the chance to finish. I didn't mean to ruin everything, she whispered without. Looking at him, Carlos didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead. Up in the cockpit, Captain Rhodes adjusted the control flaps as the plane made its final descent. His headset buzzed with an incoming call from dispatch. Captain Rhodes, be advised, airline executive team will be waiting at gate 12 upon arrival. Please do not allow disembarkation until Mr. Graves and involved crew have been met by leadership. Security has also been informed. The captain acknowledged the instruction with a dry copy but inside he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He had captained dozens of flights for the company, but none that came with corporate waiting on the jet bridge. This wasn't turbulence, this was damage control, and it had already started before the wheels hit the runway. As the plane descended through the final layer of cloud, a subtle hush fell across the cabin. Some passengers glanced out their windows, watching the coastline crawl closer. Others watched Eldon. He remained motionless as if preparing for a boardroom meeting instead of landing. In 2C, Olivia refreshed her email again, heart pounding. The journalist she knew had already published something, breaking airline shareholder allegedly removed from first class mid-flight internal review underway. A second headline followed minutes later. Witnesses confirm racial profiling incident on board flight 728, high-ranking investor targeted by staff. Sean leaned over. They're running it. Olivia turned the screen toward him. It's out across the aisle. Trent caught sight of the headline and exhaled deeply. Well, he said, they're not burying this. As the wheels met the tarmac with a soft but final thud, the aircraft slowed, rolling toward the gate. Outside the windows, the usual rush of ground crew activity was missing. Instead, 2 men in dark suits stood at the top of the ramp near the gate's entrance. Another uniformed security agent waited just beyond the glass eyes focused on the aircraft. Inside, the mood was brittle. A sharp chime rang out. Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the captain has turned off the fasten seatbelt sign. We ask for your patience as we finalize our arrival procedures. No one moved. Eldon didn't unbuckle. Melanie, now trembling slightly, stood frozen in the galley, her mouth dry. Carlos quietly stepped out into the cabin and made his way forward, stopping at seat 1. Mr. Graves, he said in a low voice, the executive team is at the gate. They've asked to speak with you directly before anyone else deplanes. Eldon nodded once I assumed as much. Carlos hesitated. Would you like me to accompany you? Eldon looked up, I appreciate the offer, but no, this is something I'll do alone. Carlos nodded, then moved aside. The fasten seatbelt sign turned off with a ding, and yet no one rose. Everyone remained seated as Eldon stood. He reached into the overhead bin, retrieved his slim briefcase, and straightened the collar of his jacket. His movements were deliberate. Controlled, not theatrical, just precise. As he made his way down the aisle, the passengers in first class parted in silence. Olivia and Sean gave him a small nod. Trent stood briefly and said, "For what it's worth, I'm glad I witnessed this." Eldon paused, met his eyes, and replied, "Then I hope you do more than just witness." He continued walking. As he reached the front of the plane, the door opened with a slow, quiet hiss. The suited executives stepped aboard. One extended a hand. "Mr. Graves," he said, "I'm Jonathan Kerr, Vice President of Corporate Affairs. On behalf of the airline, I want to." Eldon didn't take the hand. "I'm not here for apologies," he said flatly. "I'm here for answers." Kerr lowered his hand. Behind them, Melanie watched from the galley doorway, her heart pounding as two security agents quietly approached her position. One spoke softly. "Mom, we'll need you to step off the plane with us." She didn't move. Carlos, standing nearby, gave her one final look. A mix of disappointment, pity, and clarity. "It was never just about a seat," he said. And with that, Melanie stepped forward, flanked by the two officers, her footsteps shaky, the whisper of her shoes nearly drowned out by the sound of her career slipping away. Back in the aisle, Eldon turned once to glance at the cabin. No gloating, no smile. Just the same calm expression he had worn all flight long. Then he stepped off the plane. And the real consequences began. The terminal was eerily quiet on the far end of Gate 12, where three sharply dressed executives stood stiffly beside a row of tinted glass windows. Behind them, a security team waited in plain Navy uniforms, their postures relaxed but alert. A few airport staff members lingered at a distance, whispering and pretending to check their tablets, while keeping one eye on the jet bridge. Everyone had heard something, none of them knew the full story. Eldon Graves stepped into the terminal with steady, unhurried steps. His suit was still smooth, his tie still perfect. In one hand he held his briefcase, in the other. Nothing, he needed no documents, no lawyer, no entourage. His presence alone brought the tension to its peak. You didn't need noise when you carried this kind of power. Jonathan Kerr, the Vice President of Corporate Affairs, stepped forward again now, a bit more nervous than he had been at the aircraft door. He extended his hand once more. "Mr. Graves, I just want to say again." "Were I asked for answers," Eldon interrupted, his voice low and controlled. "Not handshakes." Kerr quickly lowered his hand and gestured toward a nearby private conference room, a glass-walled office space used for last-minute flight operations. "Of course, we've prepared a space for privacy." "I'm not concerned about privacy," Eldon replied, "but if it helps you avoid public embarrassment, I'll allow it." The executives traded brief glances, then they led the way inside. As the glass door closed behind them, the passengers from first class began to disembark. Olivia, Sean, Trent, and the Lowells all paused as they stepped into the terminal. There was no doubt about where Eldon had gone. The room was clearly visible through the glass, and Eldon's presence commanded the center like a courtroom judge. Trent shook his head. He didn't have to say much, but he said everything that mattered. Olivia replied softly, because he knew this wasn't just about him. Back on the jet bridge, Melanie stood beside two security officers who were gently but firmly guiding her toward a separate door off the main path. Her lips were pressed together tightly, her face pale. She hadn't said a word since she left the aircraft. She didn't ask questions, there were none left to ask. She was led into a different office down the hall, this one smaller, colder, and intentionally less comfortable. Inside the executive meeting room, Eldon removed his jacket and placed it over the back of a chair. He didn't sit yet. He let them sit first. Kerr cleared his throat. "Mr. Graves, I'm sure you're aware that this incident has escalated rapidly. We've already suspended the crew member involved and are launching a full internal investigation. We've also prepared a draft statement acknowledging the incident and reaffirming our commitment to equality." Eldon remained standing. "Do you think a press release fixes this?" he asked. His voice didn't rise, but it filled the space like wind through a cracked window. Do you think that announcing sensitivity training again will erase the message? This incident sent to every black passenger, every black employee who sees the news tomorrow. Kerr shifted in his seat. No, sir, we don't. That's why we want your guidance in how to move forward appropriately. You'll receive a letter from my legal team within the next 24 hours. Eldon replied. In that letter, you'll find a detailed request for the following: first, a full investigation into all complaints made in the last 3 years that involve seat errors and boarding misunderstandings. I want demographic data. I want timestamps. I want patterns. The director of policy, a woman in her 50s, named Evelyn Brooks, nodded quickly and began writing. Second, Eldon continued, I want a full overhaul of the training protocol, not a slideshow. Not a check-the-box session. I want immersive, behavioral-based training. I want independent facilitators with no ties to your HR department. Understood. Kerr said, trying to keep pace. Third, and most importantly, Eldon said, I want a public apology issued not just to me, but to every passenger who's been quietly humiliated without consequence. I want it delivered by your CEO, not a spokesperson, not a social media intern. Kerr hesitated. We will need to run that through our. Eldon raised a hand. Your CEO can decide how many headlines he'd like to read tomorrow morning. You're lucky this incident stayed quiet as long as it did. Behind the glass, a few terminal staff watched nervously. Some of them had pieced together the story already. Others had only seen the flight attendant being walked off the plane. But the message was becoming clear. Something had gone very, very wrong, and someone powerful was not letting it disappear. After several minutes, Eldon sat. He opened his briefcase, removed a neatly folded sheet of paper, and slid it across the table. This is a copy of the personal statement I intend to share publicly, he said. It's not negotiable. It will go live tonight. I suggest you read it before you start crafting your own response. Kerr picked up the page and scanned the first line. This week I boarded a flight as a paying customer. Within minutes, I was treated as a threat. Not because of what I said or did, but because of what I looked like. His face paled as he read on. Eldon rose again, buttoned his jacket, and looked around the table. I won't be issuing lawsuits, am not interested in payouts, am interested in permanent change. You can either help make that happen, or you can answer for why you didn't. He turned and left the room without another word. Outside, Olivia and Sean stood near a news camera that had just rolled up. A reporter adjusted her microphone. That's him, someone whispered. Eldon stepped out into the terminal as the first question flew toward him. Mr. Graves, can you comment on what happened during the flight? He paused, then he said, What happened on that flight has happened to hundreds of people who never got a chance to speak. The only difference is, this time the wrong person stayed silent for too long, and the right one didn't. And then he walked straight through the terminal, briefcase in hand, the press chasing behind him. The storm had landed, and it had a name. The sun had fully dipped behind the San Francisco skyline. By the time Eldon Graves stepped into the black sedan, waiting outside the terminal, the glass doors closed behind him with a soft hush, separating the chaos of the airport from the calm he carried with him. The driver nodded politely and pulled away, navigating the winding lanes, as reporters scrambled to follow on foot, some calling out his name, even as the car disappeared into the stream of departing traffic. Eldon didn't look back. Inside the car, silence reigned. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and cedar. He sat upright, his briefcase resting across his lap, his phone blinking softly in his palm. Dozens of unread messages, news alerts, legal updates, and yet his thumb hovered over none of them. Instead, he stared out the window as buildings passed like ghosts each, when a memory of a life he'd built brick by brick, from boardrooms to terminals, from policy to press. He had fought to make sure no man or woman ever had to prove they belonged in a seat they'd already paid for. Yet here he was again. His phone buzzed, a message from Marianne Delaney, his chief counsel, all major outlets running the story. We've secured time with Channel 8 and NCR tomorrow morning. CEO of the airline has requested private meeting. Your terms are being circulated internally. Another buzz. This one from Kendra Lewis, head of public relations, socials on fire. Seat for justice trending. Gravesgate now a top 5 topic, 42,000 reposts in 2 hours. Response 80 positive. You've got the public. Behind you, he stared at the screen, then set the phone face down. He didn't need trends. He didn't need hashtags. He needed systems to change. At that very moment, 3,000 miles away, a boardroom full of executives sat in emergency session. The airline's general counsel, the chief risk officer, the VP of diversity and culture, and the CEO Everett Langford all sat around a thick glass table under bright overhead lights, while a monitor at the far end streamed live media coverage. Langford rubbed the bridge of his nose, then dropped his hand flat on the table. We can't fix this with a statement. That man has credibility, reach, ownership, and a following. We underestimated. He's not asking for money, said Evelyn Brooks, flipping through a folder. Hez asking for numbers, data policy rewrites. Langford exhaled slowly. Hez asking for a full confession. The legal advisor spoke up. The public already sees it that way. Melanie Dorsey's image is circulating. There's a petition demanding her termination and accountability from management. Langford's jaw tightened. She's been suspended indefinitely. Full investigation pending. And what about Grevesque conditions? Someone asked from the far end of the table. Langford tapped the file in front of him. We give him everything. Full access to the internal review process, external facilitators for training, monthly reports to shareholders and the public. If we don't, we risk losing him and the reputation we spent 30 years building, another executive added. And is right, we've had similar incidents, minor brushed off, documented poorly. This one just hit the wrong man on the wrong day. No, Langford said standing, he was the right man, the only one who wouldn't let it slide. At that same time, in a modest one-bedroom apartment across town, Melanie Dorsey sat on the edge of her couch, still in uniform. Her phone lay silent on the coffee table screen. Dark, no messages, no missed calls. Her apartment was clean, but the silence was crushing. No TV, no music, just the echo of her earlier choices bouncing off every wall. She opened her laptop. Her email inbox had filled with automated notification, media mentions, legal statements, internal HR updates, and one new message from an unknown sender. She clicked it. Miss Dorsey, we've reviewed your initial report and will proceed with formal hearings this week. You are required to submit a written statement acknowledging your account of the events. Failure to comply will result in termination of employment and revocation of benefits. Internal investigations. She sat back and stared at the ceiling. The corners of her eyes stung. She wasn't crying, but something inside her felt cracked, like a rope she had pulled on too hard had finally snapped. Her actions hadn't come from hatred. She'd never seen herself that way. She had friends of every background. She donated to causes. She reposted diversity quotes. But none of that mattered when her behavior under pressure told the truth. She had acted from a reflex, one shaped by years of subtle messaging, silent permissions, unchecked assumptions. She'd judged a man by a look and treated him as if he didn't belong in a place she'd known. Now she was facing the cost. Back in the car, Eldon finally opened his phone again. He opened the draft of the public statement he'd written in flight and reread the last paragraph. This was not an isolated act by one employee. This was the result of a culture that still measures dignity by appearance and respect by assumptions. My story is not unique. It only became visible because of who I am. But if it helps others claim their seats without explanation, without apology, then I'll keep telling it. He tapped a send, and within minutes his statement was published on every major platform, shared by leaders, activists, journalists, and ordinary passengers who had lived smaller versions of the same story. A young woman named Zoe Whitman shared it on her page with the caption, "I was kicked out of first class last year because I looked too young to afford it. I cried in the airport bathroom and never spoke up." Mr. Graves, thank you for not staying silent. A retired teacher named Gregory Parks wrote, "Watch this unfold on the plane. I said nothing, that won't happen again." We've got to do better. We've got to start speaking up before the person humiliated needs to make the call. And far away at a different airport in another city, a black father sat beside his teenage son, waiting for a delayed flight. He opened the news, read the headline, and handed his phone to the boy. "Read that," he said. "That's how you carry yourself in a storm." The boy nodded, eyes wide, as he scrolled through Eldon Graves' story, and without knowing it, thousands of miles from where it all began, the ripples had already reached another seat, one that might now be protected because a man refused to be quietly escorted off a plane that he helped build. The storm hadn't just landed, it had started to clear, but the skies would never look the same again. The next morning arrived with headlines on every major news network. Airports across the country had TV monitors playing the same story on loop news. Anchors in press suits used words like corporate reckoning, systemic shift, and accountability in motion. But beneath the polished phrases, it was clear something rare had happened. A quiet humiliation had gone public, and this time the man at the center wasn't pushed into silence. In downtown San Francisco, Eldon Graves stepped into the lobby of the Langston Equity Building. His company's headquarters, a large digital screen behind the reception desk, displayed a rotating slideshow of the firm's recent accomplishments, school infrastructure projects, environmental tech startups, prison reform initiatives. It was a subtle, constant reminder that this wasn't just a business, it was a mission. Employees in the lobby paused as he walked past. Some offered respectful nods. Others looked at him with something between awe and gratitude. He was no longer just their founder or chairman. He had become a public symbol overnight. Not because he chased fame, but because he'd refused to sit quietly when disrespected in a space that should have been his. By right, he rode the elevator to the 30th floor, stepped into the boardroom, and was met by his leadership team. His senior strategist, Julian Pierce, pulled him aside. "Press is waiting downstairs," Julian said. "3 major outlets, everyone wants the exclusive." And the airline just released a full statement, public apology signed by the CEO, plus confirmation that Melanie Dorsey has been terminated. Eldon's face didn't move. Anything about policy reform, Julian handed him a printout. "They're adopting every measure you proposed. Full transparency audits, external compliance monitors, racial bias training embedded into annual certification. And they've invited you to consult on long-term culture strategy." Eldon read the page carefully, then set it down. "They're not doing this because they believe in it," he said. "They're doing it because they're afraid not to." Julian gave a small nod. "Does that matter?" "No," Eldon replied. "What matters is what happens 2 years from now, when the spotlight fades and people return to routine. We need to make sure this isn't a seasonal change. It needs to stick." They stepped into the boardroom. The meeting began, across town in a quiet cafe. Olivia and Sean sat with a journalist from Channel 8, giving a first-hand account of what they saw on board. Olivia spoke with composure, but her voice carried weight. It wasn't just about Mr. Graves being asked to move, she said. It was the way she looked at him, like he didn't belong, and when he refused to be humiliated, she escalated it. She didn't expect him to have power. The journalist nodded, scribbling furiously. "And how did he respond?" Sean leaned in. "With patience, with control, but also with precision. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He let the system expose itself, and then made sure people saw it." Meanwhile, in a neighborhood just outside the city, Melanie Dorsey sat at her dining table with her mother, Patricia. Her apartment was still the curtains drawn. "I made one mistake," she said, her voice hoarse. "One." Patricia shook her head gently. "It wasn't one mistake, sweetheart. It was years of small things you never questioned. You just didn't notice until it hit someone who could make you see it." Melanie looked down, her fingers trembling around a chipped coffee mug. "I don't hate anyone, Mom. I didn't even think about his race until I was already treating him like he didn't deserve to be there." "And that's the lesson," Patricia replied. "It's not about hate. It's about habits. It's about how easily we believe we know someone's place." Melanie blinked hard. "Do you think I deserve to lose everything?" Patricia reached across the table and took her hand. "I think you have a chance to learn, but only if you stop trying to defend who you were." Melanie didn't answer. But for the first time in days, she didn't argue either. Back in the city, Eldon's team reviewed the live social metrics from his public statement. Over 1 million shares, endorsements from Fortune 500 CEOs, civil rights organizations quoting him, universities requesting permission to use his speech and training material. He scrolled through the comments, some angry, some relieved, most supportive. One stood out: "I'm a flight attendant. I saw this happen before and stayed quiet. I won't anymore. Thank you for giving people like me the courage to speak." Eldon closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. His office looked the same as always. Mahogany shelves, minimal decor, quiet elegance. But it felt different now. Like a courtroom after a verdict. He thought about the quiet power of restraint, the strength it took not to yell, not to shame, not to throw names and threaten lawsuits. Instead, he'd chosen something harder: to hold up a mirror, let them see themselves and walk away with dignity intact. And because he had others, had found the strength to do the same. Later that afternoon, Channel 8 aired a full-length segment titled "The Seat That Spoke Back." It included footage from the airport interviews with witnesses, clips of Eldon's speech, and expert commentary on racial bias in professional settings. The closing words from the anchor struck a chord across the country. Eldon Graves didn't ask for special treatment. He asked for equal treatment, and when that was denied, he didn't explode. He exposed in doing so. He reminded us all that silence can be graceful, but it should never be mistaken for acceptance. In living rooms, dormitories, offices, and break rooms across the nation, people watched. Some nodded, some wept. Some looked inward. And in one small town in Georgia, a young black boy named Landon, no older than 10, watched the final frame with his grandmother. He turned to her and asked, "Grandma, can someone like me really own an airline?" She smiled, kissed the top of his head, and said, "Baby, someone like you already does." And just like that, a new story began quietly but powerfully, rooted not in shame, but in truth. A seat had been taken back, and the ripples were only just beginning. That evening, as city lights blinked on like stars made of steel and glass, the nation had already begun absorbing the deeper meaning behind what had happened. Social media timelines were full of discussion, not just about what Melanie Dorsey had done, but about what it represented, about how many people had been asked to prove they belonged in places they earned, about how many stayed quiet, ashamed of something they had no reason to be ashamed of, and about what it meant when someone finally said, "No more." In a small radio studio tucked away in Oakland, Harriet Banks, a longtime civil rights commentator and host of the syndicated show Real Talk Now, turned on her microphone. She adjusted her headset and looked through the glass at her producer, who gave her a thumbs up. Her opening words were calm but layered with meaning. "This week," she said, "a man didn't shout, he didn't sue, he didn't threaten. He simply stayed in his seat and let the truth do the shouting for him. And in that moment, he told every person watching, you don't have to shrink when someone tries to erase you." Her phone lines lit up, call after call. People shared their own stories that had never made the news stories of being followed in stores, challenged at gates, questioned in offices. One woman recounted being asked repeatedly if she was in the right classroom during a college orientation. A man recalled being mistaken for a delivery driver in his own building. Each story echoed the same wound: assumptions tied to skin status, judged by stereotype. Back in San Francisco, Eldon sat alone in his kitchen. No cameras, no assistants, just him, a cup of tea, and the soft tick of the grandfather clock his father had left him. On the counter beside him lay a stack of letters, printed emails, handwritten notes, even a few thank you cards that had been overnighted by people he didn't know. He picked one up and read it slowly. It was from a woman in Chicago. "Dear Mr. Graves, I watched your story with tears in my eyes. Not because I was surprised, but because you didn't flinch. You didn't rise to the bait. You rose above it. My teenage son now thinks differently about his own value. Thank you for showing him, no, showing all of us, what dignity looks like in motion." He folded the letter carefully and set it aside. In a world that often rewarded loudness, Eldon had done the opposite. He had let his silence expose what noise usually tried to hide. His phone buzzed, a call from Dolores Brighton, the CEO of a Fortune 100 company and longtime ally Eldon. She said warmly when he answered, "I know you didn't ask for the spotlight, but now that you have it, you're changing things. I just got off a call with our diversity council. They're using your incident as a case study. I hope that's all right." He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "It's not about being all right, it's overdue." Well, she replied, "Let me know if you ever want to make that consulting group real. People are watching and they're ready to listen. especially from someone who didn't just talk. You showed it. They ended the call, and Eldon returned to his thoughts. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel celebrated. What he felt was something colder, something heavier, the weight of being visible. Because he knew visibility didn't always mean progress. It sometimes meant pressure. It meant being asked again and again to explain what others didn't have to be both teacher and example, to remain calm when anger was justified, to respond gracefully when grace had not been extended, and still he carried it. Meanwhile, at the airline's corporate headquarters, Everett Langford sat with his communications director and general counsel. The room smelled like late coffee and expensive regret. "We underestimated him," the comms director said. "And now the board is demanding quarterly progress reviews on equity initiatives." Langford didn't look up. "Good, maybe we should have been doing that already. And Melanie Shez already been released without pension. Legal made sure of it." The general counsel leaned forward. "There's talk of inviting Mr. Graves to serve as a public-facing advisor. Give him a seat at the table formally. Not just for optics, because he earned it." Langford gave a slow nod. "I'll draft the invitation myself. But make no mistake, this isn't about mending fences. This is about keeping promises." Elsewhere, in dozens of classrooms and corporate training centers, Eldon's name began appearing in slide decks and discussion guides. His face appeared in news documentaries and town halls, but more importantly, his story began living in people's minds. At a high school in Baltimore, a black student named Trevor Hill was preparing to give a speech for his school's ethics club. He adjusted his blazer nervously and stepped up to the podium. His printed paper shook slightly in his hands. "My topic," he began, "is about what we do when we are told without words that we don't belong. It's about Mr. Eldon Graves, and about why quiet strength can change more than outrage ever could." In the back row, his teacher, Miss Danvers, wiped the corner of her eye. Meanwhile, Eldon sat back in his chair, the windows open, the city breathing quietly outside. He thought of his mother, long gone now, who used to tell him, "You don't need to win every fight. Just make sure when you walk out of the room they remember what you stood for." And tonight, across the country, across industries, across ages, people were remembering, not just because of what had happened, but because of how he answered it. And as night settled in, the world turned a page, not a chapter marked by outrage, but by reckoning, still strong, unmistakable. And finally beginning to echo in places that had once been too quiet for too long. By midweek, the ripple effects had grown into waves that reached far beyond the airline industry. What started as a quiet injustice inside a first-class cabin had become a national mirror held, steady by the man who had simply refused to be erased. Eldon Graves had not just reclaimed his seat, he had forced the country to ask how many others have been told they don't belong, and how many stayed silent because they knew no one would believe them. At a leadership summit in Washington, D.C. policy, advisors, Fortune 500 executives, and media leaders gathered for a panel that had been scheduled months in advance under the vague title, Equity in Access. What none of them had anticipated was that Eldon's story would become the centerpiece of the entire event. The keynote speaker, Reginald Carr, a respected civil rights attorney and thought leader, stood before the audience holding up a printed photo of Eldon, seated calmly in one. The grainy still had been taken by another passenger mid-flight, before the confrontation, before the headlines, before the apology. "This," Reginald said, "is not a man making a scene. This is a man surviving one. Look at the posture, look at the dignity, and look at what we assumed when we first saw this image online. That's what we're here to talk about." He turned to the crowd, voice calm, but deliberate. "Eldon Graves didn't demand compensation. He demanded correction, and he showed us something rare, that real strength doesn't always come with volume. Sometimes it sits perfectly still and lets everyone else show their hand." The audience applauded, not politely but deeply. Meanwhile, inside Langston Equity's top-floor conference room, Eldon sat with a group of young professionals from across the country. It was the first in a new initiative he had quietly launched. The Belonging Project, a mentorship and funding program focused on breaking gatekeeping systems in corporate America. Seated around him were 15 young leaders, all of whom had faced different versions of what he had endured, need internships for cultural fit, questioned for their accents, passed over, despite degrees that matched their peers. One of them, Rhea Martin, a sharp, quiet tech graduate from Detroit, spoke up. I keep wondering if I had been on that flight and it happened to me. Would anything have changed? Because I don't have shareholders, I don't have media pull, am just someone trying to get in. Eldon nodded slowly. That's why we're here, he said. So the next time someone like you is challenged for belonging, they won't be alone, and they won't need headlines to be heard. He didn't offer inspiration, he offered structure strategy, a roadmap for protection, legal, financial, institutional. Not theory practice. Back at the airline's HR division, a mandatory all-staff virtual meeting was underway. Across time zones, thousands of employees tuned in to a new training series titled Bias in Real Time. The first module wasn't animated or theoretical. It began with a reenactment of the incident from Flight 728. Word for word, body language included. It was uncomfortable. It was real, and it ended with a single sentence in white text across a black screen. What you believe quietly will eventually speak loudly through your actions. One supervisor, Kathy Monroe, a 20-year veteran, sat watching in her Denver office, arms crossed. By the end of the session, she was crying. She turned to her team and said, "We've all been Melanie Dorsey at some point. The question is, what do we do now that we know it?" At the same time, in a mid-sized airport in Atlanta, a black businessman in a sharp gray suit walked toward the first-class gate for Flight 990. As he approached the desk, the agent glanced at his ticket, then looked him up and down briefly. He held her gaze. For a split second, she hesitated, then caught herself. She smiled, genuinely scanned the ticket and said, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Reed. Enjoy your flight." Behind him, another passenger watched the moment unfold. A slight change in posture, a barely noticeable pause, but also a shift. Because the headlines hadn't just exposed a system, they had created caution, awareness. And in small, quiet moments, the culture was bending one interaction at a time. Meanwhile, Eldon returned home late that evening, his steps a little slower, but his focus undimmed. He poured himself a glass of water, walked to the study, and opened the final letter from the pile. It was handwritten on soft parchment, no return address. "Mr. Graves, I was on that flight. I sat in row 4 across the aisle. I didn't speak up. When I should have, I watched you handle yourself with more grace than I've ever seen. I've spent the last few days thinking about how many times I could have spoken out for others, but chose the safe silence instead. I just want to say, I hear you, now I see it, and am changing how I lead because of what I saw you do. Thank you, a coward who won't stay one." Eldon folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a record, a marker of what change looked like in real time. That night, the city moved on. Flights landed. Planes took off. People hurried to work. Kids laughed in parks. But across those routines, a quieter thread stitched itself into the fabric of daily life. Conversations changed slightly. Glances softened, systems paused before acting. And it wasn't because Eldon had shouted. It was because he hadn't needed to. He had made the silence speak louder than the noise ever could. And for the first time in a long time, the world had actually listened. The following Sunday morning, just as the sun pushed softly over the rooftops of San Francisco, Eldon Graves stood alone on his townhouse balcony, holding a steaming cup of black coffee. The city hadn't changed. Its streets still hummed below. Buses still sighed along their routes, and joggers still passed with earbuds and focused eyes. But Eldon felt something subtle in the air, a shift not in noise, not in headlines, but in the way people now paused, thought, and looked closer at moments they used to ignore. He looked down at the street where days ago no one would have known his name outside of corporate circles. Now cab drivers nodded at him, children pointed, and strangers sent him messages, not to praise him, but to say thank you, or simply, "I saw it happen. I've lived it too." His phone buzzed gently on the balcony table beside him. A message from Marianne, his chief counsel. "Final Numbers Airlines Board has approved every item you pushed. They've also invited you to lead a national coalition on bias in commercial policy. It's happening." Eldon. All of it. He read the message, nodded once, and set the phone down without replying. He didn't need confirmation. The work wasn't done. But it had begun downstairs in the heart of a local community center. A group of teenagers had gathered for a weekend mentorship event hosted by Langston Equity. The walls were lined with simple posters, quotes from civil rights leaders, innovators, and now one from Eldon himself. The seat in power. The seat is proof that you were always meant to be there, even when someone else forgot. Among the teens, Zoe Whitman stood at the front with a marker in her hand. Just a week ago, she had shared Eldon's story on her social media with trembling fingers. Now she was teaching younger students how to respond when challenged, how to remain composed, and how to document and protect themselves. Because the fire Eldon had lit didn't end in boardrooms. It was lighting corners in classrooms, airports, and family homes, places that were never on camera, but where the real battle had always lived. Somewhere in Florida, Melanie Dorsey walked through a quiet park away from the headlines. No job, no uniform. Just her a notebook and the consequences of every choice she had made. She sat under a tree and opened the journal she had started days earlier. Her first words on the page, "I believed I was fair." But fairness isn't what you say. It's what you do when no one's watching. I didn't lose my job. I was forced to face who I had become. She kept writing not for public redemption, but because real change she now understood started in silence too. Back in Eldon's office, a framed newspaper front page had just been delivered. The headline read, "Justice at 30,000 feet and beyond." Below the bold type was an image of Eldon walking calmly through the terminal, his briefcase in hand, his eyes straight ahead. Behind him, the chaos had already begun. Ahead of him, change was waiting. He placed the frame on the wall, not at eye level, but just beside the door, so that every time he left the room, he would remember not the storm, but the walk that came after it. And in homes, offices, and crowded terminals across the country, people remembered the man who stayed seated when told to move, who didn't yell when insulted, who didn't break when they tried to bend him. He reminded the world that dignity isn't granted by rank, color, or class. It's lived, carried, worn like armor. And when that kind of dignity refuses to stand down, systems shift. The plane landed days ago, but the impact's still flying. This wasn't just a story about a seat on a plane. It was about respect, silence, and quiet justice. If this story meant something to you, please give it a like. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this.